Instead, I told the room exactly what I could prove and exactly what I could not. I showed Grant's tasting room threat, documented in a text I sent my sister that same night, then presented the timestamps linking Caldwell's reassessment request to the vendor cancellations. I acknowledged that no email instructed either supplier to punish me, and I also acknowledged that Vincent's response had been unilateral, excessive, and made without my approval. Grant's attorney asked whether I had benefited from Vincent's intervention, and I said yes, because the deliveries returned, then explained that benefiting from an action did not mean authorizing it. The hotel's general manager asked whether Vincent had influenced my selection for the gala, and I answered that he had added my name to a short list while my chef made the final decision. Nothing about the truth made me look perfectly innocent, but I had finally stopped treating credibility like a performance requiring perfection. The meeting ended without clearing me, and corporate compliance kept my promotion frozen while requesting additional vendor records from both parent companies. That afternoon, another pastry director from a sister property was appointed interim regional lead, a position close enough to the one I wanted that everyone understood what might happen if my review dragged into the next quarter. I congratulated her because she had earned her own career and did not deserve to become a villain inside mine, then locked myself in a dry storage room and cried beside 40-pound bags of flour. My chef found me 10 minutes later, handed me a paper towel, and asked whether I wanted comfort or strategy. I laughed despite myself, because apparently boundary awareness had become contagious. "Strategy tomorrow," I said, and he nodded before leaving, without telling me everything would work out. The break came from somewhere none of us had expected, and because it came imperfectly, I trusted it more than a dramatic confession. One of Caldwell's junior analysts contacted the hotel's compliance hotline after learning the review involved my promotion, then provided an internal meeting recap he had written the morning after Grant's threat. The notes showed Grant asking his team to examine whether vendors connected to the Halstead were appropriately aligned with a property employing someone who had created reputational risk for a key account director. Grant never ordered a cancellation, but the analyst documented him naming both companies and instructing staff to create commercial pressure before the gala. An internal message from Grant to another director made the motive harder to disguise. She needs to understand that professional relationships have consequences too. It was not cinematic proof of a master plan, but it was enough to transform coincidence into conduct. Caldwell placed Grant on administrative leave within hours, while the Halstead cleared me of wrongdoing and scheduled my promotion process to restart under a different regional panel. Vincent called after the decision became public internally, and for once he began with, "Do you want to know what my lawyers think?" I said no, and he replied, "All right," with an audible effort that almost made me smile. Later that evening, I found him near the gala stage, where technicians were testing lights while he pretended to understand an equipment diagram upside down. I told him compliance had cleared me, and relief crossed his face before he asked whether the promotion was restored. "The interview is restored," I corrected. "I still have to earn it." He nodded, then admitted his intervention had made the investigation harder, and apologized without adding that he had meant well. I asked Vincent whether he understood why intention had not been enough, and he said he was beginning to, though the answer clearly annoyed him. When Claire was in danger, moving first probably saved time, he said, and I got used to believing speed proved I was useful. He looked toward the stage rather than at me, then admitted that usefulness had become a convenient excuse whenever asking permission might produce an answer he disliked. It was the least elegant thing I had ever heard him say about himself, which was probably why I believed it. I told him I had a similar habit, except mine involved making myself agreeable before anyone had the chance to reject me. Neither problem disappeared because we recognized it, and neither of us promised otherwise. We simply stood in the half-finished ballroom until a technician asked us to move because we were blocking a cable. The gala succeeded on Saturday, although almost nothing about the menu resembled the one I had planned before the vendor crisis. I kept the restored chocolate delivery, but replaced the imported citrus with Michigan cherries, rye crumble, cultured cream, and burnt honey, because I no longer wanted 600 desserts depending on companies I did not trust. The final food cost landed 4% above target rather than 20%, while overtime stayed within the contingency my chef had quietly protected months earlier. More importantly, my team moved through service without knowing how close their work had come to becoming evidence in somebody else's fight. When the last plates left the kitchen, I stood beside the dish station and felt something closer to exhaustion than triumph. Careers rarely change in a single heroic moment. Mostly they survive because people keep doing the work, while larger problems make noise around them. My promotion interview happened 12 days later, before a regional panel that included no Mercer representatives and nobody who knew Grant socially. They asked hard questions about vendor concentration, conflict disclosure, labor forecasting, and why I had allowed one dessert program to depend on two suppliers under related ownership. That last question embarrassed me because it had nothing to do with Grant and happened to be correct. I admitted I had optimized for ingredient quality while underestimating concentration risk, then presented a revised sourcing plan using secondary vendors and seasonal substitution protocols. The panel did not reward me for surviving humiliation or admire my personal growth, which was exactly how I wanted the meeting to work. 3 days later, my chef called while I was tempering chocolate and told me I had been appointed executive pastry director for the region. I sat on an overturned milk crate after the call because my knees stopped cooperating, and one of my sous chefs assumed somebody had died until I started laughing. The promotion meant 6 kitchens, 58 employees, a larger budget, and enough administrative responsibility to make me nostalgic for 16-hour shifts. Vincent heard through the foundation rather than from me, and his only message that afternoon read, "Congratulations. I am told regional leadership survives entirely on bad coffee." I replied that espresso still did not count as breakfast. He waited almost 3 hours before answering, "This promotion has already made you arrogant." That was all, and the restraint felt better than flowers arriving at work, because the achievement remained mine before it became part of whatever existed between us. Grant asked to see me once before Caldwell transferred him out of Chicago, and I agreed to coffee in a crowded hotel cafe because I had questions I no longer feared hearing answered. He looked tired, without the polished brightness he wore around clients, and admitted Caldwell had required counseling as part of his continued employment, after investigators found several other instances where personal irritation had influenced account decisions. He said losing the Halstead business had finally forced him to see how often he treated access as leverage, both professionally and personally. When I asked why my success had bothered him so much, he stared at his coffee and said, "Because people started knowing me as your fiancé, and I hated that more than I knew how to admit." He had criticized my body because it gave him a place where he could still feel superior, and hearing him say it plainly hurt less than all the gentler explanations he had offered before. Grant asked whether I could forgive him, and I told him I probably would someday, but did not know what forgiveness would look like from his side of the country. He laughed once, painfully, then asked whether Vincent and I were together. "No," I said, which was still true, and Grant looked surprised enough that I realized he had understood the entire conflict as a contest between men. I told him leaving had never been about choosing somebody else, because replacing one source of permission with another would not have changed much. He nodded as though the answer required more time than our coffee allowed, then apologized without asking me to make the apology easier for him. When he left, I watched him cross the lobby and felt no victory, only the quiet sadness of seeing a person finally understand a lesson after the relationship requiring it had already ended. For the next 6 months, Vincent and I saw each other mostly through foundation work, and occasionally because Claire invited both of us to dinner without admitting she was doing it deliberately. He still made mistakes, including sending a driver once after I mentioned working late, then remembering halfway through the arrangement that I had not asked for one. I declined the car, and he canceled it without sulking, though Claire later informed me he complained to her for 20 minutes about Chicago parking lot crime statistics. I still made mistakes too, especially when disagreement made me assume disappointment was coming, then over-explained until Vincent finally asked why I was arguing against something he had never said. Progress was not particularly elegant in either direction. It looked mostly like noticing old instincts before they became new damage. At a winter tasting 6 months after the gala, Vincent appeared beside my dessert station wearing a charcoal coat and the expression of someone trying unsuccessfully not to look pleased with himself. I handed him dark chocolate mousse with burnt honey, sea salt, and candied orange, then waited while he tasted it with insulting seriousness. "Too much salt?" I asked. He considered the question, took another bite, and said, "No, but I was hoping you'd argue with me." I told him he needed hobbies, and he said Claire had suggested the same thing with less diplomacy. When he asked whether I wanted dinner Friday, there was no grand speech, and no attempt to make the invitation sound inevitable. I let the silence sit between us for several seconds, partly because I needed to hear what he would do with uncertainty. Vincent waited, and when I finally said yes, the relief on his face was so ordinary that it made me trust him more. Our first dinner lasted nearly 3 hours, because neither of us knew how to behave once there was no gala, crisis, or mutual enemy organizing the conversation. Vincent chose a small neighborhood restaurant where nobody greeted him by name, which I suspected was intentional until he admitted Claire had selected the place because she said his usual restaurants made every date feel like an acquisition meeting. He asked about my mother, my first kitchen job, and why I had become a pastry chef when savory cooks received more television glory. I asked why he worked inside the Mercer Empire instead of escaping it, and he admitted leaving had once seemed cowardly because his father's businesses employed thousands of people whose lives would not disappear simply because he disliked the family history. There were parts of that history he did not romanticize, including intimidation and favors exchanged under rules he was trying to dismantle, without pretending the name had become clean overnight. The answer complicated him in a way I preferred to mystery, because power became less attractive once somebody described the cost of carrying it honestly. Dinner became another dinner, then Sunday walks, badly timed lunches, and one argument serious enough that we went home separately and did not speak until the following evening. The argument began after an anonymous voicemail threatened the Halstead during a labor dispute, and Vincent wanted private security assigned to my building until police determined whether the message was credible. I wanted the building manager notified, police documentation completed, and security limited to work locations unless investigators found a direct connection to me. Vincent thought my plan underestimated risk, while I thought his plan expanded his authority simply because fear made expansion feel responsible. He did not surrender gracefully. He paced my kitchen, argued statistics, and once said, "I'm trying very hard not to do what I want here," which made me furious enough to laugh. Eventually, we agreed on temporary hotel security and a police liaison, and the threat proved unrelated to me 3 days later. What mattered afterward was not that Vincent respected my boundary perfectly, because he had spent half the argument trying to move it. What mattered was that he did not punish me for holding it, arrange private protection behind my back, or convert his fear into proof that my judgment was defective. I also had to admit that his concern was not automatically control, simply because Grant had taught me to distrust concern, which became its own uncomfortable lesson. We began learning the difference between influence and coercion, the slow way, by making requests, hearing answers we disliked, and deciding whether affection could survive disappointment. Sometimes Vincent was still controlling, and sometimes I was still defensive before anyone threatened me. Neither of us became healed enough to stop being complicated. We simply became better at repairing what our complications did. A year later, Claire opened a non-profit training kitchen for women rebuilding careers after leaving controlling relationships, using foundation funding, private donations, and a curriculum my team helped design. We taught budgeting, food safety, baking, interview preparation, and basic business planning, because dignity was easier to rebuild when it came attached to practical choices. On opening morning, a woman named Denise burned the first batch of dinner rolls and apologized so many times that everyone in the kitchen stopped pretending not to notice. I watched her face tighten, with the same fear I once carried whenever Grant's disappointment entered a room, then heard Claire tell her they had enough flour for another batch. Denise stared at her, as though failure without punishment was a language she had never learned. I understood the expression immediately, and for once, recognition did not hurt. That afternoon, a letter arrived from Grant, addressed to the nonprofit rather than to me, along with a donation made anonymously enough that I would not have known the source if Claire had not recognized Caldwell's forwarding address. The note contained only 2 sentences, explaining that his mother had finally left his father after 38 years, and that Grant now understood why she had always looked nervous when someone praised her. He did not ask me to answer, forgive him, or acknowledge the money. I folded the note and placed it inside the office file rather than carrying it home, because some apologies belong in the past, even when they arrive sincerely. Grant's life had become his responsibility, just as mine had finally become mine. The distinction no longer felt cruel. Vincent proposed 18 months after our first dinner, although the proposal nearly failed because he leaned against a flour-covered counter and ruined a coat that probably cost more than my first car. He had come to the pastry kitchen after closing, carrying no flowers and visibly irritated, because Claire had warned him that anything involving a private dining room would look like he had staged a corporate merger. He asked whether marriage was something I could imagine wanting with him before he reached for the ring, and I laughed because apparently, even proposals in our relationship required pre-negotiation. "That wasn't the question I practiced," he said, looking genuinely annoyed with himself. I told him the practiced question could wait until he knew my answer to the important one. Then I said yes, because by then, marriage felt less like being chosen and more like choosing repeatedly beside someone who understood he could not make the decision easier by making it for me. He opened the ring box afterward, knelt because he wanted to, rather than because the moment required perfect choreography, and asked the traditional question badly enough that I made him repeat it. I said yes again, then noticed flour across his sleeve, and laughed until he looked personally betrayed by the entire pastry profession. There was no audience to approve of my body, no rival watching him claim me, and no powerful declaration that changed who belonged to whom. There was only the hum of refrigeration, the smell of chocolate cooling nearby, and a man holding out his hand without closing it around mine first. Years earlier, I had believed love was proved by how hard somebody fought to keep you, because that was the language Grant had taught me to mistake for devotion. Vincent taught me something different only after he stopped trying to teach me anything at all. When I put my hand in his, both of us understood I was there, because the door had always remained open. He argued that this was different because nobody was trapping me, and I asked whether using his daughter's health to make refusal feel selfish, truly qualified as freedom. The words hurt him, but I did not soften them, because the problem was not that Roman lacked good intentions. Eleanor had possessed good intentions too. I told him Sophie needed her father to survive one difficult dinner without building a new system around her fear, and I needed to know I could matter in that house without becoming medically necessary to anyone. Roman looked at the contract for a long time before sliding it away. When I picked up my coat, part of me wanted him to ask me not to leave, which exposed the version of my own wound I preferred not to examine. He did not stop me. Instead, he asked what he should do with Sophie that night. I told him to knock on her door, ask whether she wanted company, and accept whatever answer he received without turning silence into another emergency. If she wanted him outside the room, he could sit outside. If she wanted space, he could tell her where he would be and mean it. Roman nodded without asking whether that would make her eat tomorrow, because perhaps he finally understood that tomorrow's appetite was not the only measure of whether tonight went well. I walked to my car feeling both relieved and strangely rejected, which was how I discovered that wanting freedom did not prevent me from wanting proof that my absence mattered. Behind me, Roman remained inside the house rather than following. For the first time since we met, neither of us used another person's need to make the next decision easier. Roman did not call that night, and by the following afternoon, I had checked my phone often enough to become irritated with myself for expecting the exact behavior I had told him not to perform. At 3:17, Sophie sent a photograph of the old kitchen covered in flour, with Roman standing behind a pot wearing rolled sleeves and the expression of a man losing an argument with dinner. Her message said, "Dad made the stew, and it is too salty," followed by another explaining that he had refused to throw it away, because apparently mistakes could become leftovers. I laughed in the middle of the bistro's prep rush and asked whether she had eaten any, then deleted the question before sending it because I realized I was about to repeat the same monitoring I criticized. Instead, I asked whether she had helped, and Sophie replied that she chopped one carrot, hated it, and spent the rest of the time drawing beside him. An hour later, she sent a photograph of 2 bowls at the kitchen table, neither empty, with no explanation attached. Over the next 2 weeks, I learned about Roman's changes mostly from other people, which mattered, because change performed directly for me would have been difficult to separate from courtship. Sophie said formal dinner had become optional. Staff no longer asked what percentage of a meal she finished, and some nights she and Roman ate cereal in the kitchen after everyone else went to bed. Her therapist remained involved, and Roman scheduled follow-ups with Sophie's pediatrician instead of deciding that relaxed meals had magically solved everything. He also began therapy himself, something Eleanor mentioned with the grave tone of someone discussing a relative joining a suspicious religion. The household was not suddenly cheerful, and Sophie still had evenings when food made her anxious. But those evenings stopped producing meetings, reports, and adult faces arranged around her discomfort. The absence of drama seemed to give her room that no amount of intervention had created. I had my own habits to confront while Roman was learning his, because distance removed the comforting illusion that I was merely the sensible person in someone else's dysfunctional house. At the bistro, I routinely covered employees' shifts instead of letting them trade with each other, checked inventory after my manager had already checked it, and answered messages on days off because being unavailable made me anxious. When my sous chef told me I was exhausting everyone by refusing to trust them, I started to defend myself with the language of standards before hearing Roman's voice in my head, using almost identical reasoning. I gave my manager control of weekly scheduling, promoted the sous chef officially, and took one Sunday away from the restaurant without inventing an emergency to justify returning early. The day felt uncomfortable rather than liberating, which was probably a better sign than instant enlightenment. I spent most of it at Margaret's old house, helping my aunt sort boxes nobody had opened since the funeral. We found no missing financial dossier from Evelyn, only copies of ordinary correspondence, and one envelope addressed to Margaret that had never been mailed. The postmark was absent because Evelyn had apparently written it during her final month and left it among personal papers Eleanor later stored without reading carefully. In the letter, Evelyn thanked Margaret for keeping the recipe card and apologized for involving her in a family conflict she could not safely solve. She also explained why Margaret should not deliver the card immediately after her death. Roman needed to discover what kind of life he wanted without one more dead relative instructing him from beyond it. If he ever came looking, Margaret could show him. If he never did, she was to let the recipe remain simply a recipe. That answered the question that had bothered me since Evanston. Because Margaret's silence was no longer a convenient plot of lost boxes, but a choice made under explicit instruction. Eleanor brought Sophie to the bistro several days later during a rainy lunch, and she looked almost comically uncomfortable at a table that wobbled unless someone folded a napkin beneath one leg. Sophie ordered tomato soup and half a grilled cheese, then changed her mind after the food arrived and asked whether she could take the sandwich home. Eleanor inhaled as if an old response had reached her mouth first, then asked the server for a box without commenting on what remained. I noticed because restraint is easiest to recognize in people accustomed to authority. Their silence has weight before it becomes natural. While Sophie drew on the paper placemat, Eleanor admitted Roman had asked her to join a family therapy session the following week. She had initially refused, then changed her mind after Sophie asked why adults were allowed to tell children therapy was helpful while avoiding it themselves. Eleanor also told me something Roman had not known, a detail small enough to matter more than another dramatic secret. Before Evelyn became ill, she and Margaret had sometimes met, simply to cook and complain about their families, not to plan escapes or exchange evidence. The stew originated with Evelyn's mother, but Margaret changed the onions and added sour cream, while Evelyn eventually began making Margaret's version at home. Sophie had therefore recognized a taste that was already the product of friendship rather than a Hayes family relic stolen or preserved intact. That history stripped some grandeur from the mystery and gave it something better, because the recipe had survived through ordinary afternoons between two women who trusted each other enough to alter it. When I later told Roman, he smiled at the fact that everyone had spent weeks treating sour cream like classified information. He came to the bistro after closing that night because I invited him, and we sat at the counter while rain tapped against the front windows. I read Evelyn's final note aloud, then handed it over without watching his face for a lesson I could extract. Roman stayed quiet for several minutes before saying he had been angry with Margaret for withholding the card, although the letter made that anger feel unfair now. He admitted that part of him still wanted every missing document recovered and every decision explained because complete information felt like another form of safety. I told him some questions deserved answers, and others simply ran out of witnesses. He looked at me then and asked whether I had missed him. I said I had missed Sophie, his catastrophic parsley technique, and perhaps him in an amount I was not prepared to itemize. Roman smiled and asked whether he could take me to dinner sometime, saying nothing about what he could provide, arrange, or protect me from. I wanted to say yes, because he had changed, which was precisely why I told him I needed a little more time to know whether I wanted him, rather than merely wanting to reward him. He nodded, paid for the coffee despite my protest, and left without making disappointment my responsibility. Watching him walk through the rain hurt more than I expected, but the hurt no longer felt like evidence that either of us had done something wrong. Sometimes a door remained open precisely because nobody stood in front of it. I accepted Roman's invitation 3 weeks later, after Sophie invited me separately to her school art show, which made the timing feel less like a reward and more like an ordinary life beginning to overlap. Her drawing hung near the end of the hallway and showed a crooked house with 4 yellow windows, a red front door, and one small figure standing outside beneath a tree. I remembered an earlier version she had drawn without any door, but I did not point that out, because children deserve to change without adults turning every crayon mark into a psychological report. Sophie volunteered the difference herself, explaining that the person outside might be coming or going, and she had not decided which. Roman asked whether the distinction mattered, and she shrugged before saying, "Not if they have a key." Eleanor looked away long enough to compose herself, then complained that public schools used unnecessarily emotional art assignments. We went to a neighborhood diner afterward because Sophie wanted pancakes, and halfway through the meal, she pushed her plate away with most of the stack untouched. Roman's hand tightened once around his coffee mug. Then he asked whether she wanted the pancake boxed or left behind. She chose a box, returned immediately to telling us about a classmate who had eaten glue in kindergarten, and nothing else happened. That absence of consequence moved me more than any speech could have, because 6 months earlier 5 adults had made one untouched plate feel like an emergency. Roman caught me watching him and raised an eyebrow, but I did not tell him I was proud of him because he was not a child completing an assignment for my approval. I simply stole one of his fries and asked why he had ordered salad at a diner. Our first date happened 2 nights later at a small Ethiopian restaurant Sophie found after searching for places where rich dads cannot act important, a phrase Roman pretended not to find offensive. We talked for nearly an hour before either of us mentioned grief, family, or Sophie, which was when I realized how little I knew about the man beneath the emergencies that had introduced us. Roman had once wanted to study architecture and still sketched buildings when he could not sleep, although his father pushed him into the family organization before he finished college. I told him I opened my bistro because Margaret's bakery made work feel tangible, something I could fix with heat, salt, timing, and patience when other parts of life refused to cooperate. He asked why I never expanded despite having enough demand, and I admitted that growth required trusting people with something I had built to survive. Roman laughed softly and said neither of us had chosen subtle coping mechanisms. Before anything between us became serious, I asked him to explain the part of his life everyone else politely described as the family organization. Roman did not romanticize it or pretend his money came entirely from legitimate companies, which would have made the rest impossible for me to trust. His father had controlled illegal gambling, protection rackets, and laundering operations alongside legitimate real estate and logistics businesses, while Roman inherited both after years of gradual involvement. Since Claire's death, he had been closing the violent operations, settling obligations through attorneys where possible, and moving legitimate companies under independent management, although several relationships remained dangerous enough to require professional security. I told him I would not enter a relationship where information affecting my safety was withheld because he decided ignorance protected me. Roman agreed that if he could not tell me enough to make an informed choice, then he had no right to ask me to make that choice. The answer did not make his history clean, and I appreciated that he did not expect love to transform discomfort into approval. I spent several days considering what I had heard, asked questions he occasionally disliked, and declined one dinner when I needed space without receiving a parade of messages afterward. When we saw each other again, Roman told me he had wanted to send security past my apartment after I failed to answer a text for 2 hours, then called his therapist instead and discovered I had simply been at a movie. I laughed until he reminded me that personal growth apparently involved paying someone to prevent him from embarrassing himself. When he walked me to my car, he stopped close enough for me to understand what he wanted, but did not touch me until I reached for him. Our first kiss was warm, slightly awkward, and nothing like the kind of cinematic surrender I once thought powerful men were supposed to inspire. The months that followed were imperfect enough to convince me they were real. Roman occasionally slipped into giving instructions when he meant to ask, then corrected himself without requiring applause, while I sometimes volunteered help nobody requested, and became resentful when people failed to appreciate sacrifices they had never asked me to make. Sophie continued therapy and had better weeks and worse ones, including a stretch around Claire's death anniversary when breakfast became difficult again. This time, Roman informed her care team, kept meals low pressure, and resisted turning temporary regression into catastrophe. Eleanor joined family sessions, apologized directly for monitoring Sophie's food, and accepted that an apology did not entitle her to immediate closeness. Some Sundays she came to dinner, while other Sundays, Sophie preferred having her father alone. I never moved into the Hayes house, and Roman never bought my bistro, solved my finances, or turned wealth into shorthand for devotion. He helped once, when a broken freezer threatened an entire weekend's inventory, but only after I asked whether his logistics company could locate emergency cold storage faster than mine could. I paid the invoice, he complained about my refusal to accept a favor, and we argued for 20 minutes before realizing I was protecting independence as rigidly as he had once protected control. We compromised when he accepted payment, and I let his staff arrange the transfer rather than staying awake all night supervising strangers. It was not romantic, but trust rarely announces itself with music. Most of the time it looks like letting someone competent carry one end of something heavy. 6 months after the dinner that started everything, Roman entered my bistro alone on another rainy Thursday and waited beside the hostess stand instead of walking toward the kitchen. I was finishing service when I noticed him, rain darkening the shoulders of his coat, and the hostess looked toward me because she knew exactly who he was, but had also learned that he waited like everyone else. When I asked whether he needed a table for one, Roman said that depended on whether I was willing to make it too. Before I answered, he glanced through the front window, where Sophie and Eleanor stood beneath the awning sharing an umbrella and arguing about something with animated hand gestures. They wanted dessert, he said, but I told them they were not invited until you decided what tonight was. I asked whether he had brought them as backup, and Roman said he had asked whether they wanted to come because apparently the distinction now governed his entire household. Then he reached into his coat and placed Evelyn's original recipe card on the counter, protected inside a clear archival sleeve. I expected him to say he wanted me to keep it, which immediately made me prepare to refuse something too symbolic to belong to me alone. Instead, he told me Sophie wanted a photocopy for her room, Eleanor wanted the original returned to Evelyn's recipe box, and he had no idea what Margaret would have wanted after all these years. So I thought we should stop deciding what dead women meant, he said, and ask the living people what they want to do with it. For the first time, the recipe was no longer evidence. I told Roman the original belonged in the family recipe box because Evelyn had written it, while the bistro could keep a copy covered in enough grease stains to horrify Eleanor for decades. He accepted the answer without finding a reason to improve it, then called Sophie and Eleanor inside after I said tonight could accommodate 4 people and 1 shared dessert. Sophie immediately rejected the dessert limitation, ordered chocolate cake for herself, and informed Roman that personal freedom apparently included whipped cream. My staff finished closing around us while I reheated the stew, and Roman rolled up his sleeves when I handed him onions, because 6 months of progress did not excuse continued incompetence with a knife. Eleanor measured pepper more carefully than anyone needed. Sophie peeled 1 carrot before declaring manual labor oppressive, and nobody asked whether she planned to eat what we made. The kitchen sounded ordinary, which might have been the strangest thing the Hayes family had achieved. While the pot simmered, Eleanor told Sophie the story of Evelyn and Margaret changing the recipe together at the bakery, including an argument about whether sour cream improved everything or merely hid mistakes. Sophie asked which woman had won, and Eleanor said both of them kept cooking their own version until nobody remembered which one came first. I realized then that I had spent months searching for a single original truth inside a recipe that had always been collaboration, revision, and memory. Roman tasted the broth and suggested more salt, which caused Sophie to shout, "Absolutely not," from across the kitchen before anyone could stop laughing. He accepted defeat and carried bowls to the counter, where we ate without ceremonial speeches or dramatic silence. Sophie finished perhaps half of hers, requested a container for the rest, and continued drawing while the adults talked about something unrelated. Eleanor left first because she had an early appointment, pausing beside Roman long enough to ask whether Sunday dinner was still happening. He looked towards Sophie rather than answering automatically, and Sophie said she wanted Eleanor there if she brought the lemon cookies Evelyn used to make. Eleanor agreed, kissed the top of Sophie's head only after Sophie leaned toward her, then left with an umbrella my dishwasher had found in the lost and found bin. The ease of it would have been invisible to anyone who had not watched this family negotiate love as if it were a security agreement. No one announced forgiveness, because forgiveness had become a series of smaller permissions rather than one grand absolution. Eleanor had done something damaging for reasons she once believed were defensible, and the consequence was learning she could remain family without remaining in charge. After Sophie went to the office to finish homework, Roman stayed beside the stove while I portioned the remaining stew. He asked whether I ever wondered what would have happened if Evelyn had managed to move into that Oak Park apartment 12 years earlier. I said probably, although imagining the perfect alternate life felt unfair to people who had been forced to survive the real one. Evelyn might have convinced Roman to leave his father's organization sooner, or the family conflict might have become worse, or nothing important might have changed before cancer arrived and took away every plan. Roman nodded because he had spent months learning not to convert uncertainty into a story where one correct decision saved everyone. What mattered now was that Eleanor's choice had been wrong, even if none of us could prove Evelyn's choice would have produced a happier outcome. Roman asked whether I thought he had changed enough, and the question irritated me because enough sounded like another finish line he could reach and then stop paying attention. I told him he still ordered for other people in restaurants when distracted, still checked the security feed too often, and still believed an expensive car constituted an apology for Chicago traffic. He smiled and asked whether there was anything positive on the list, so I reminded him that he had not sent anyone to locate me when I disappeared for 3 hours shopping with my phone dead. Roman admitted he had considered it for approximately 11 minutes. Then decided humiliation would be worse than anxiety if I turned out to be buying socks. We were laughing when Sophie returned carrying a photocopy of Evelyn's recipe card and asked for a pen. She sat at the counter and wrote beneath the copied inscription, while keeping her forearm over the page so neither of us could see. Roman asked whether she was altering family history, and Sophie said history had survived Eleanor, so it could probably survive an 8-year-old with a purple marker. When she finished, she slid the paper toward us. Evelyn's original line remained at the top, for Roman, when he is ready to remember home. Beneath it, Sophie had written, in uneven block letters, "Home is where they save your bowl when you leave the table." Roman read the sentence once, then looked away toward the window, and I pretended not to notice the shine in his eyes because being seen does not always require being observed. Sophie asked whether she could tape the copy inside the recipe box rather than keeping it upstairs, saying she might forget where she put it otherwise. Roman told her the box belonged to the family, and she was family, so she did not need permission from him alone. She considered that answer before asking me too, then called Eleanor on speakerphone and made her vote from the car. Eleanor protested the purple marker but approved the placement, and Sophie announced the decision passed 3-1 because Roman had apparently voted against the marker color without realizing he was voting. Watching them argue, I understood why Evelyn had chosen a recipe as the thing she trusted Margaret to keep. Documents could prove what happened, but food had a better chance of reminding people why any of it mattered. Roman and I closed the bistro after Sophie fell asleep in a booth with her head on a folded coat, exhausted by cake, homework, and constitutional reform. He helped me wipe the counter without asking where the cleaning supplies belonged anymore, then stopped beside me when the last light remained over the kitchen. Months earlier, he would have filled the silence with a plan, while I would have filled it with something useful so neither of us had to risk asking for what we wanted. This time he asked whether I wanted him to stay a little longer, and I said yes because I did, not because Sophie needed me, not because Roman had earned a reward, and not because anyone required saving. He kissed me gently while rain moved against the windows, then pulled away when Sophie shifted in the booth and muttered something about pancakes. A year later, there would still be difficult dinners, arguments with Eleanor, security problems Roman could not solve politely, and days when I worked too much because old habits never disappear, simply because a story reaches its final chapter. Sophie would continue growing around grief rather than out of it, carrying Claire and Evelyn in ways none of us could schedule or predict. Roman would occasionally mistake fear for urgency, and I would occasionally mistake usefulness for love, but both errors had become easier to name before they became someone else's burden. The Hayes family had once treated home as a place strong enough to prevent departure, while I had spent my life trying to become useful enough that nobody would consider leaving me. A child, a missing recipe, and two women who had been dead too long to defend themselves taught us something less dramatic and far harder to practice. The safest table is not the one nobody can leave, but the one where leaving never cancels your place when you choose to return.